Hey and welcome back to Fanfic Reading. Today we are reading How It Feels by Raalm and ToxicExotic. I hope you enjoy.
Chapter 35, Floral Scents. Ruby hummed happily to herself as she walked down the hallway. There was a lot to be happy about after all. Everything was going great with Blake. Her beautiful upgrade for her beautiful crescent rose was coming along nicely, and her grades were slowly getting better and better. She'd gone up a whole grade in dust, history, and general studies, and was super happy about that. But there was still one area she was struggling. Plant studies. With none of her team having much knowledge in that area, it had been tough to find someone who was actually good at the subject. Or at least, someone she actually knew. With the mission board having been updated the day before, word of them having killed the Helk had quickly made its way around the school. All morning, people had been saying hello and asking her about it, and while it was certainly fun to have everyone look at her with awe, she tried her best to cut those conversations short. After all, the win still didn't feel earned. The plus side was that with how people were trying to get close to the new popular team, she knew she could ask any of them for help with her studies. But most of them weren't even in her year, let alone her friends that she felt comfortable around. However, as luck would have it, she had walked into the shared dorm kitchen and seen Ren making smoothies with a bunch of weird-looking plants. While their schedules were mostly the same, she and Team J and PR didn't share every class. So, after asking what they were and hearing him talk, she'd asked what his grade was, and found out he was top of the year. She had been so happy to have finally found someone who could help her, and asked immediately for him to tutor her. Fortunately, he'd accepted. So when he had finished making the smoothies, they began to make their way back to her dorm to study. However, what waited for her took her completely by surprise. Laid on the couch was a small, shining white Beowulf almost twice the size of Zvi, its head resting on its paws. As soon as the door opened, one of its eyes opened and looked directly at her. Normally, the very shape of the beast would have caused her to immediately reach for her scythe, but there was always something warm about Wise summons that put her at ease.
Ruby?
Rin said hesitantly.
What's that?
Good question. She chuckled and stepped into the room.
Wise. I'm studying.
The impatient reply came from one of the desks that lined the room. Weiss was sat hunched over with her hair let down, a sign that she'd been studying for at least a few hours, a book, her pen scrawling back and forth along her notebook.
And the Beowulf? Training my aura regeneration,
she said dismissively, and waved to a scroll that sat beside her. Pulled up on it was her aura bar, which was constantly rising and falling around 80%.
Ignore it. Fair enough.
Ruby shrugged, knowing that the beast was likely just going to sleep there since Weiss wasn't giving it any commands.
Interesting,
Ren said and walked forward, stopping down to glance at the Beowulf. A hand reached out and touched its nose, but the thing didn't react.
It feels like the real thing, but I can sense it with my aura. It feels like part of you is sitting here, Weiss. Well, it kinda is really.
Ruby laughed and sat down next to the wolf. Again, it paid her no mind as she ran her hand through its soft fur.
Anyway, plant studies? Ah, yes. Mistral plants, right?
As she gave a nod, Rin stood back up and pulled a surprisingly large book from his bag. It looked like it weighed a ton, and when he sat down and opened it, she saw that almost every inch of it was covered in writing. In the corner of each page he turned was an illustration of the plants, and the boy finally came to a stop at a pale pink rose, though its green stem was far more tangled than any rose she'd seen before.
We'll start simple. Hulentia is on pretty much every test.
Ren began and placed the book between them.
Its pollen is a powerful hallucinogenic that uses our aura to influence what we see. It's generally used to treat depression.
Almost an hour and a half had passed since they'd sat down to study. In that time, they had only covered 3 different plants. As it turned out, Ruby had severely underestimated just how much went into the course, and was realizing just how stupid her previous study sessions of 10 minutes per flower was incredibly stupid. There was just so much to go over, from natural affects, to brewing and uses, then side effects to dangers. Even with how thorough Ren was being, Ruby could tell that he was leaving a few details out to make it easier. She knew that it would take another few hours after the study session to sift through every note she'd taken, to at least try and make sense of it all, but it did feel like she was learning something at least. After all, less than an hour ago she hadn't known that willow bark could be used to relieve pain and became stronger when mixed with drainweed, but mixing it with gildweed, which happened to look almost exactly like drainweed, turned it toxic. However, Before Ring could teach her exactly how to tell the two apart, the door slammed open, and Yang stood in the entryway. A wide grin was on her face, and a strawberry milkshake was in her hand. Beside her was Blake, looking tired and a little fed up.
Talk of the school, Blakey. Cheer up a little. Unlike you, I would rather not be the talk of the school. It makes people nosy.
Ruby watched her sister shake her head, but the smile didn't falter.
Sup, peeps?
Yang addressed the room cheerfully. Before she could even take 2 steps in the room, the Beowulf that had been silently sleeping raised to all 4s and glared at the girl, a loud growl rumbling from its throat. Yang was unfazed though, and approached it with a smile to kneel down. From her back pouch, she produced what looked to be a vanilla candy bar and held it out to the friendly Grim.
Take this to your master, little girl.
Ruby watched the bee size Yang up for a little longer, but it soon took the candy bar into its mouth and jumped off the couch. When it finally arrived at Weiss, the heiress absent-mindedly reached down and took the sweet, giving the summon a brief stroke before putting on a pair of headphones. With the world around its master blocked out, it curled up around her feet and kept a wary eye in their direction.
Weird. Oh well,
the blonde said and dropped into the seat that the summon had just vacated.
Here you go, sis.
A chocolate bar was placed into her lap.
Sorry, Ren. Didn't know you'd be here, or I'd have got you something. It's fine,
the boy replied with a smile as he closed the book.
I should get back to my own room anyway. Nora wants to train a little when she gets back. That's what you two call it, huh?
Yang giggled.
Yang.
Blake let out a sigh and Ruby shuffled a little to the side as the raven-haired fauness squeezed between her and her sister.
I swear. What else would we call it?
The male asked with a confused look on his face.
Ignore her, Ren,
Blake said and closed her eyes, Ruby feeling a hand slip around her waist and pulling her close.
Okay. Well, I should be going. Ruby, we can continue on Thursday if you want? Definitely,
she said with a nod. Apparently satisfied with the answer, the boy gave them all a small wave and quickly walked out of the room. Letting her head fall onto Blake's shoulder and pulling her knee up onto the couch, Ruby nestled into her girlfriend's side and picked up her notebook. It was a little messy, but she could at least make it all out.
Poor guy. Madly in love and doesn't even know it.
Yang sighed and sank further into the couch, reaching into her pocket to pull out her scroll and turn on the holiviewer.
What were you two studying anyway, Rubes? Plants. Boring. You're boring. Nice try, sis. So what were you two doing?
She asked Blake while Yang quickly switched it to her favorite channel, one that ran superhero action shows all day, and sipped on her milkshake.
You're a little sweaty. Sorry, I'll shower soon. It's fine.
She shook her head slightly and hoped Blake wouldn't see her blush. It was a little embarrassing, but the slight smell of sweat, mixed with the girl's perfume, reminded Ruby of waking up wrapped in the fauness' arms the morning after they'd chosen to sleep together on the couch.
So who are you fighting? Neon and Ivory.
That explained why Blake seemed a little fed up. While Ruby knew the two fauness were friends, not that Blake would ever admit it, she still remembered how at odds the both of them were on certain topics. And though the rainbow-loving girl's behavior didn't really bother her, she could see how it would annoy other people. Especially when taunting was a big part of how Neon fought.
How'd it go? We won, of course,
Yang answered with a shrug.
Thinking about stealing her damn rollerblades, though. Aw, can't keep up?
Ruby teased and stuck out her tongue. She had only fought against Neon once, but had easily won by being naturally faster.
Don't need to keep up when you can slow them down, says the one who shouted at her to fuck off and went to fight Ivory instead.
Blake yawned.
Thankfully, I don't have as much as you to make fun of.
Ruby couldn't help but laugh. It sounded so unbelievably like Yang that it really didn't take much to envision it. Hell, she could remember the time when they were kids that she'd watched from her room as Yang screamed at birds and chased them away from the house. That had continued for almost 6 months before she finally seemed to give up and let them be.
Yeah, well, we still won.
The blonde shrugged.
Not sure about going with them to juniors next week, though. Loud music might drown her out. So long as you don't drag me with you.
Ruby knew her girlfriend's plea had fallen on deaf ears. Whenever Yang went out clubbing, she would usually drag Blake with her too, and Ruby suspected it was her sister's attempt to get Blake out of her shell a little.
You know the rules. If I Hey, wait a minute.
Yang turned to face her partner with a scowl.
What do you mean as much as you? Exactly what I said.
Blake grinned, obviously amused by Yang's reaction.
You can't deny that you're definitely. Definitely what, Blake?
The blonde's voice was low and dangerous.
Bigger.
Ruby finished for her girlfriend, laughing as she dodged the scroll that was thrown at her.
You lot wouldn't know perfection if it slapped you in the face. Pretty sure I'm holding it,
Blake replied smugly. Ruby felt herself blush as Yang let out a disgusted groan and stood from the chair to retrieve her scroll. However, she didn't bother to return and instead walked over to Blake's bed. Picking up a cushion, she walked back to the couch.
Hey, Rubes. Lift your head up.
Huh?
Yang, don't why.
Before Blake could finish her sentence, or Ruby could dart away, Ruby felt herself pulled into a headlock. As she tried to pull away, the pillow was mashed against the top of her head and rubbed back and forth.
Gaw. Ya-ing. Stop.
The assault continued for a couple of seconds, but Yang finally let her go and shoved the pillow into Blake's face. A wide, mischievous grin was on her face as the fauness slowly pulled it away and looked at it with what seemed like a pained look.
Good luck sleeping now,
she said, and returned to the beds to jump up onto her own.
Stupid brute.
Ruby grumbled and fixed her hair, not quite sure what Yang had just done. However, since the girl was gone, she pulled out her own scroll and turned it over to a documentary channel.
Want to go over these notes with me? Huh?
The amber eyes finally pulled away from the pillow and locked onto hers.
Oh. Yeah, sure.
Blake quickly threw the pillow back onto her bed and cuddled closer to Ruby to look over her shoulder. Apparently, though, the over-the-shoulder view wasn't good enough, and she saw a glint in the girl's eyes. A kiss was placed on her neck before she felt herself being pulled backwards on the couch until the two of them were laid next to each other. Unable to resist a giggle, Ruby twisted onto her side and happily cuddled up to her girlfriend, handing her notes out to the waiting hand. Feeling a little brave, she also draped a leg over Blake's. Before they started their own little study session, though, she looked up and pressed her lips against the faunus. Feeling the warmth rush over her, she let out a content hum before finally pulling away and resting her head on the girl's chest.
Much better,
Ruby breathed and settled down to study. The past hour had been nice. She'd enjoyed helping her girlfriend understand her notes from plant studies, even though it wasn't a strong suit of hers. During it, she'd held her in her arms and been comfortable, even despite the fact that her hormones were driving her up the nearest wall. Not that returning her bed, while Ruby showered, made things any better. Thanks to Yang's earlier antics, her pillow now smelled of nothing but the red-headed reaper, and Blake knew that falling asleep was going to be a pain in the ass. Though many people often found comfort in having something that smelled of their partner, those people often only found that comfort because said partner was not available. But Ruby was. She would be in that very room, and the smell would only make Blake want to cuddle up to her more. However, despite them having already chosen to spend a night together on the couch, Blake wasn't sure if Ruby was at the point where she could just request it because she felt like it. But maybe they were. The couch had not only been a place where they slept, but where they had been spending a lot of free time. It wasn't unusual for them to get back from classes or practice and just drop onto the sofa together, and unless Velvet and Coco were over, or someone from Team JPR, their position would usually always default to laying side by side. And she really liked that. Being enveloped in Ruby's scent, feeling the warm body against hers, the gentle rise and fall of the girl's chest against her ribs, they were all wonderful. She just wished her body was simply content with just those things. Though her mind was perfectly happy with that being all that happened, that didn't mean her body didn't still respond. It didn't mean she didn't feel herself getting aroused when Ruby's hands moved in just the right way, which they seemed to do frequently. Blake knew it was her own fault though, and that her choice of reading material didn't exactly help matters, but she really did wish her body would just fall in line. That it would understand there were so many things that were more important than some carnal release. Like how barely even 5 minutes after they'd laid down, Ruby had reached up to pull away the ribbon that kept her ears hidden. Or how Ruby had laughed for a good minute when the documentary on bears had made a comment about their protectiveness, and Blake had made a remark about Yang. Or even just how the fact Ruby fingers seeking out her own could send such joy rushing through her. They were all far more important to her. They were all things she would remember in the long run, but still, her body's natural response was pushing those things out for the night.
What's up with you?
The rough voice brought her out of her thoughts, the slightly cracked cadence signifying that it hadn't been used for a while. With Jan already asleep, she knew it could only be one person. Opening one eye, she saw Weiss sat on her bed stretching her arms. She hadn't heard a single peep from the heiress all night, which wasn't too unusual for Weiss, but she had found it curious that she'd kept her summon up the entire time. It had acted as a guard dog, defending its master with a growl when any of them got too close, but it was nowhere to be seen anymore.
Just thinking.
Blake sighed and turned onto her back.
About?
Though Weiss didn't look to be paying attention, there was a curiosity to her voice.
You wouldn't understand,
she replied. Blake knew Weiss wasn't exactly inexperienced, especially since she knew things had definitely happened with Neptune, and Weiss wasn't shy about admitting to it, but she also knew Weiss was always a little more closed off when it came to actual relationship stuff. She didn't doubt that the coldness was just a front, but she also couldn't forget how easily the girl had shot down John and ditched Neptune.
Let me guess,
the girl said with a roll of her eyes.
You want Ruby to join you tonight, but are worried to ask. How did yo? Maybe because all you two have done recently is lay together, or because I'm not blind,
Weiss said shortly. Blake knew she wasn't intending to be, though.
Or maybe because all I have heard from Ruby for the past 2 days is that exact thing. Really?
Blake sat up a little on her bed.
Yes. It's very annoying. I'm actually starting to miss her babbling about weaponry. Oh. So I should just ask her? You should. Then that's what I'll do. Good.
Weiss' tone signified that the topic had run its course. Just like usual, though, the heiress' no-nonsense attitude had helped her find the answer she needed quickly. The snow-haired girl let out a small yawn and stretched her neck. Despite only having eyes for Ruby, Blake could hardly deny how pretty Weiss was. With her fair skin, silken hair, and pretty features, all wrapped up in a highly intelligent package, Blake could easily see why so many guys at Beacon had tried to pursue her for the first few months. However, the girl always seemed far more focused on her studies than actually accepting any of the offered dates, even finally putting a stop to the offers by publicly berating one of the boys that asked her out and shouting that she wasn't interested in any of them. Even with Neptune, Blake knew that studying had always come first. She understood, of course. The girl's father was an unbelievable asshole, even without the hatred she had for him personally. It was never hard to see how Weiss' mood shifted after he called, or how she would work herself sick when she felt she was underperforming enough for him to take an interest. Blake knew how those relationships felt from experience, though hers was a little different, and hated seeing her friend stuck in one without any way to help. Nevertheless, that didn't mean she couldn't try.
You were studying for a while today?
She said, keeping her voice as neutral as she could.
Ruby said you were studying when she got back too. Gave me something to do while I worked on my aura regeneration,
Weiss said dismissively.
Only went down to 40%. Could be better, but not too bad. Yeah, Ruby mentioned that. Never seen your summons act like that though? Like what?
Confusion was written across the heiress' face.
I dunno. Like a dog. Oh. No idea. I wasn't ordering it to do anything, so it must have just done its own thing. Fair enough.
A large black glyph appeared between them and began to rotate at high speeds, causing the girl to vanish from sight completely. Blake knew it meant the girl was getting changed for bed.
I haven't seen you study that much in a while though,
Blake retried.
Not since before the party. You okay? I'm fine, Blake,
Weiss said firmly.
Would just rather not come second in an area I am supposed to specialize in again. You're still annoyed about Flint beating you? I'm annoyed that I have been studying dust my entire life, that my family built an empire on dust, and yet I'm getting beaten in a test by some just player from Mantle with a shut-down shop.
Blake remained silent. Though Weiss' words had been harsh, she knew what was coming.
I shouldn't have said that.
Weiss sighed, clearly disappointed in herself. As the sound of springs greeted Blake's ears, the glyph vanished and she saw the heiress sat on her bed in her nightgown.
Dust is my thing. It's the only thing I have, and everything my future is. If I can't even come first in our class, how can I deserve to run a company?
Blake knew those words weren't Weiss. She knew what it felt like to have someone exert so much pressure on her life that her own words became their too.
Those are your father's words, Weiss,
she said softly.
You have so much more than dust, and you can do anything with your future.
Turning onto her side, She gave her teammate a firm look. Don't let him dictate your worth. Weiss' tired eyes locked onto hers. Everyone seemed to be under the impression that they were icy just because of their pale blue color, but Blake actually found them to be warm more often than not. Nevertheless, Blake could tell the conversation was over from the way they flicked to the side. I know. The girl groaned and fell back onto her bed. But I should get some sleep. We have a test tomorrow. Knowing it was useless to argue with Weiss, Blake accepted that the discussion was over and gave a small nod. Night, Weiss. Good night. Laying back down in her bed, Blake turned to stare up at her own partner's bed, since Weiss had already turned away from her. Though nobody else would have even thought anything of it since Weiss always slept facing the wall, Blake remembered how Weiss had slept facing her for a while after the truth had come out, so that simple action meant a lot to her. That show of trust made it hurt even more that Weiss was still caught in such a relationship with her father. However, before she could really think on how to help the girl a little more, though she definitely wasn't going to stop trying, the door to the bathroom, and Ruby stepped out in her normal black t-shirt and hard-stamped pants. Drying her short hair with one hand and brushing her teeth with the other, the girl happily danced over to her desk and ran a finger over her notepad. That kind of thing had been happening a lot lately, Ruby's sudden realizations and the rush to write it down, and Blake always found it extremely cute. How was yo? Where are you? Ruby jumped in her spot and spun around, her chest rising a little. Oh, Black. Thought yo would sleep. Huh? Clearly realizing her mistake, the girl pulled the brush from her mouth and gave a nervous chuckle. I thought you would be asleep, she clarified. Think I might put on my... Despite it not being said, Blake felt her cheeks warm at what had apparently almost happened, but quickly pushed the image aside. Yeah. Blake breathed and flipped back to face her. Just one of those nights, I guess. She lied. You turning in for the night? MHM. We have a test tomorrow, and I have a good feeling about it. The redhead tossed the towel aside and picked up a hairbrush from Weiss's desk, which was right next to hers. The tips of the bristles glinted red in the lamplight, and as she pulled it through her hair, the damp strands of dark silk quickly dried and fell back to frame her pretty face. I'm sure you'll do great. All that effort you've been putting in is showing. Thanks. The girl beamed happily, though glanced down at her toothbrush. 1 minute. Watching the girl run back into the bathroom, Blake heard running water quickly followed by gurgling. A couple of seconds later, though, she ran back out and bounced over to stand beside her bed. Night, Ruby said, stooping low to press their lips together. However, when the girl pulled away and began to walk backwards towards her bed, Blake reached out and took her hand. Wait. Ruby immediately stopped, a little confusion on her face. You don't have to go. The confusion lingered a little, but realization soon took over and Ruby's eyes widened. Not if you don't want to. Blake bit her lip nervously as she watched thoughts pass over her girlfriend's eyes. While they had already shared a night together, the couch was hardly as intimate as a bed. There were no covers on the couch. It wasn't as warm, and there was only one real position they could sleep in without it being uncomfortable. Thankfully, though, the girl didn't take too long to decide, and quickly smiled as she took a step forward with a small nod. Feeling a rush of happiness run through her, Blake shifted back and pulled her covers open to allow the girl to slip inside. Once she put them back into place and wrapped an arm around her warm girlfriend, who turned to face her. Remembering what Weiss had said earlier, she gave the Reaper a soft smile and reached up to tuck a strand of hair out of Ruby's face. You know, I could definitely get used to this, she admitted, seeing Ruby's face break into a grin. Me in your bed? And waking up with you. That was a really good morning last week. I enjoyed it too. Good. Leaning forward, Blake pressed another kiss against Ruby's lips and felt a hand slip onto her waist. Pulling away, she couldn't help but smile herself. We could make it a regular thing? She said cautiously. If you want. You mean every night? Ruby asked, her voice quiet and a little embarrassed. No, not every night. Unless you want to, that is. I just mean that I wouldn't complain if you wanted to just slip in whenever. Ruby's silver eyes widened again, but it didn't seem to be from shock. It almost felt like the girl was weighing up a couple of things. But the smile remained on her face, and she soon gave a quick nod. I'd be okay with that. Good. With the understanding having been made, it didn't take much longer for the rest of the awkwardness to fade. Just with the couch, Blake turned on her back and Ruby cuddled up to her side, a leg slipping over her own, just as it had earlier. The feel of the soft material on her skin caused a shiver to run up her spine, but just as she always did, she pushed those thoughts from her mind, though it was made harder by the fact she could feel the girl's bare toes grazing her feet. But after getting settled, it didn't take too long before Blake felt her earlier tiredness begin to overwhelm her. So, with Ruby's slow breath sneaking under the top of her nightshirt, Blake closed her eyes and let herself fall to sleep. With the warmth of the leader pressed against her, and the content feeling settling in her stomach, it really didn't take too long. Chapter 36. An Outside Perspective. Yang was beginning to get used to the headaches that had plagued her every morning since the fight. They were slowly getting better, and would usually pass after a few minutes, but they were still lingering a little longer than she'd expected. The pain was manageable though. It was mostly the fact she was having to spend an extra 5 minutes in bed every morning until it passed, whereas she would normally be on her feet and starting her morning routine in seconds. She also hated that it gave her a little more time to think. She'd never really been one for thinking. Sure, her grades were good, and she was pretty good when it came to combat strategy, but for everyday life, she just went with the flow most of the time. It was easier, more freeing, and left her with fewer worries, which was mostly a good thing since she still worried about Ruby enough, but she could no longer deny that it had left her a little fragile in other areas. It was safe to say that relationships were not her strongest area. Having had mostly a string of weekend flings or one-night stands, she'd never really prepared herself for what a relationship entailed. Unlike the forgettable one-night stands and the little more memorable weekends, relationships actually gave her something to lose. They gave her something to be scared of. The same thing that she'd been afraid of for years. That they would see her as not worth sticking around for. That she wouldn't be enough for them to stay. And in a way, she was right. It hurt to think in such a way, because she knew that Coco and Velvet wouldn't be leaving for another 3 years, and even then, their relationship wouldn't be ending, but it still scared her. She loved both Coco and Velvet more than she had even thought she could less than a year ago. She remembered encountering Coco working herself to death in the sparring room after she returned from Lower Cairn, and then encountering Velvet crying in a secluded corner of the library. They'd both been her friends at the time, so she'd helped them where she could and things simply progressed from there. She could never have imagined it would lead to what it had become. However, while what it had become scared her, she wouldn't change it for the world. They were a part of her now, just as much as Ruby was, just as much as Blake and Weiss were. And she wanted that to last as long as it could, even if she had to deal with a long-distance relationship for a while. Thankfully though, both girls had been doing all they could to convince her that she was being stupid for even thinking they would just forget about her. Well, Coco was. Despite the softness Yang frequently saw, the girl was usually a little more firm in her approach to complex issues, but Yang knew that was simply how Coco was. Velvet was more affectionate though, making sure to convey how much she cared through kisses and hugs. She liked both of them equally, since one gave her the affection she craved, and the other gave her the discipline she begrudgingly knew she needed if what Weiss said was anything to go by. So, with her headache finally gone and the thoughts of her amazing girlfriends taking its place, she finally sat up and rolled out of her bed, landing lightly on the ground. Standing up, she stretched her arms into the air until numerous joints popped and let out a satisfied sigh. Looking around the room, the first thing she saw was that Weiss and Ruby's beds were empty. Ruby's wasn't too unusual since the girl liked the occasional early morning run, but Weiss's being empty was still a little odd since it was a fairly recent development. Usually, Weiss was the last to wake up. It was mostly due to her tendency to study way into the night, but the girl would usually wake up roughly 30 minutes after everyone else. That hadn't been the case for the past 2 weeks though. Whenever Yang got out of bed now, Weiss would be empty, and it still felt weird to not be shouted at for ruining her beauty sleep. The heiress was always back when she exited the shower though. So shrugging it aside, she turned around to check on her partner, and found herself a little surprised. She'd gone to bed a little earlier last night, since Coco and Velvet were busy with coursework, so she was a little surprised to see that Ruby was not actually out running, but curled up in Blake's bed, the fawness arm visibly wrapped around her waist where the quilt had slipped down. The two looked extremely comfortable, and Yang couldn't help but smile at them as she reached down and pulled the cover back up. She was happy for her sister. Happy to see the girl so clearly in love, even if she didn't realize it herself yet. As much as she joked and teased them about how openly affectionate they'd been, she was really glad that her best friend and her sister were happy together. RWBY definitely deserved it, and by the gods did a wonderful girl like Blake deserve something good in her life, even if Blake thought she didn't sometimes. That was still something Yang was working on fixing permanently though. Since she didn't want to wake the two up, Yang silently moved to the other side of the room and picked up her headphones, slipping them into her scroll and putting on a decent workout track, of which she had many, and began to stretch for her morning exercises. They really weren't much, simple push-ups and sit-ups, using the bar they'd set up in the corner between the walls for a few sets of pull-ups. Simple stuff that allowed her blood to start pumping and work the sleep from her bones. After that, she'd meditate for 15 minutes, letting that energy slowly work its way out of her body so that she came down naturally. However, towards the end of her workout, before she could get to her usual meditation, the door opened and a sweaty Weiss walked into the room. She was wearing her usual workout clothes, which even Yang had to admit made the girl look spectacular. Where normally there would be some kind of tight shirt and combat skirt combo, their girl liked to wear jogging bottoms and a sports bra that left her stomach exposed when she was doing her standard exercises. And though Yang preferred shorts and a baggy t-shirt, she could definitely see the appeal to Weiss' outfit, as even exercising was rather rigorous for huntresses, and the outfit allowed her body to breathe rather well. Though it did have the additional issue of frequently making Yang's eyes glued to the heiress' incredible physique. Weiss' body was like most huntresses in that it was pretty toned and flat, but unlike most, the skin was unblemished by the usual scars that littered the bodies of those in their line of work. Instead, it was all soft, untouched skin. But even though Coco and Velvet didn't mind her looking at others, hell they did plenty of it too, Yang pulled her eyes away from the beautiful body, as she didn't want to be leering from her friend. Seeing Weiss pull a wireless earpiece from her ear, she let go of the bar she was doing pull-up on with one hand and did the same.
Been for a run?
Yang asked, continuing her pull-up with one hand.
You've been up early a lot recently.
Yeah, the girl hummed as she began to undo her braid, clearly still a little breathless.
Working on my stamina. Would rather not almost die again because I can't keep up.
Yang knew what the girl was talking about. She'd been behind RWBY and Weiss in the tunnel and watched the heiress begin to tire and stumble. While the girl was like a vengeful angel on the battlefield with everything she could do, her stamina always was her weakest point. It was probably why Pira won most of their fights, since the Mistralian had almost as much stamina as Yang herself.
Gotcha. Don't you usually shower downstairs though? Nora's in there, and we both know how she is with privacy.
Yang couldn't help but chuckle. Nora was definitely someone who had never learned proper boundaries, and had a tendency to slip into the cubicle of other people while showering to continue whatever conversation she was having. Though Yang didn't really care and never made an issue of it, Weiss had certain rules regarding modesty and tended to scream at whoever broke them, not that it stopped the hammer-wielding redhead.
Honestly, unless it's run, I doubt she even realizes the person is naked half the time. Then she should buy some glasses. Still won't stop her, she'll just have a better view.
Yang grinned as Weiss let out a small groan of disgust and moved over to her drawers. With how small the room was, they could fit two inside, so they each shared one with their partner.
The next time she does it, I'm wrapping a glyph around her head.
Weiss sighed as she maneuvered her way around the couch, and Yang heard a small muttering under the girl's breath. She was pretty sure it was about the couch again, which Weiss had already scolded her for 3 times for not taking it back down, but Yang liked having it there. Not only was it fun to cuddle up on with Coco and Velvet, but it meant the team could hang out together when they watched a film, instead of on individual beds or the floor. It made them all feel closer, and she really liked that, especially since it had all almost come to an end 3 weeks ago.
So?
Yang grunted, doing on more pull-up before dropping to the floor.
How is it out there today? Warmer,
Weiss said plainly.
Still pretty chilly though. Sadly not enough to keep some people indoors. Oh. Neon has taken to cheering people on as they run. Oh gods. Exactly.
Weiss let out another groan and finally pulled her towel free.
I would rather not have to listen to her incessant shouting while I run, nor Flint's damn trumpet backing her up. And does she have to flirt with everybody she sees? That girl has no concept of shame. Wishing someone else would do the flirting, huh?
Yang teased.
Do not start with that nonsense again. Hey, you're the one who called him hot.
Yang shrugged and stuck out her tongue, grabbing Weiss' uniform from the bottom of the bed to pass it to her. I stated an objective fact regarding his attractiveness. The heiress replied shortly and took the clothes. I also said he was an ass. Now please stop with that nonsense. If you say so. Jan grinned. She knew it was likely just in her head, but Flint really did seem to go out of his way to bug Weiss. I do. Weiss sighed. Now, can I please use the shower first? Because I feel gross. Jan couldn't help but think just how unross Weiss looked. The slight sheen of sweat and the loose, messy hair was actually a very, very good look on the girl. Though, she still couldn't help but compare it to Velvet and Coco, who both look even more magnificent in that state. Knowing she would be meditating in a minute to clear her head of most thoughts, Jan let those ones invade her mind a little. Sure. She grinned, earning a suspicious look from her friend. What's that smile for? Nothing. Jan grinned even wider. I'm gonna meditate anyway. Ugh. Weiss sighed and rolled her eyes before she moved towards the bathroom. Between you, Velvet, Coco, and Blake, I'm beginning to think Ruby is the only non-perverted female friend I have. Heh, from the looks of things, that might not be the case for much longer. Jan pointed to the couple, who were still fast asleep in bed, and saw Weiss give them a small glance. If she wasn't mistaken, she saw a small smile try to pull at the heiress' lips, only to be fought off. Yes, well, I'm glad to see she has finally taken my advice. Even if their canoodling has become a little tiresome as of late. Hey, they are new and in love. Give them a break. Doesn't stop it being annoying when I'm trying to focus on my studies, and all I can hear is their giggling. Weiss breathed. Anyway, I am going to shower. She pushed the door open, but before she could go inside, she stopped and turned back. Also, I am tired of walking around that damn couch. If you want to keep it here so badly, you have until the weekend to change the room around to make it more accommodating. If you don't, I will use my summons to take it back downstairs. The quick way. With that said, Weiss stepped into the bathroom and closed the door behind her. Knowing that the quick way usually involved the window with Weiss, Yang made a mental note to definitely change the room around since she really did want to keep the couch. With that note in mind though, she moved over to said window and pulled it open, climbing on the chest of drawers and sitting with her legs crossed. She always loved meditating with the breeze in her hair, so was happy to feel it was over her as she closed her eyes and got to slowly winding herself down for the day ahead. Growing up on Patch, Yang always loved the woods after rain. Though she liked the sun better, it was undeniable that the musty smell of the leaves drying out and causing the air to be filled with the beautiful floral scent definitely enhanced the experience. And though the bright green leaves of Emerald Forest definitely didn't compare to the dark trees of home, it was still pretty enough for Yang to be enjoying the walk with her girlfriends. But still, most of her attention was on Ruby, who was happily skipping ahead of her with Blake and Weiss. Despite knowing that Ruby was more than capable of handling Grim herself, it was still a tendency of hers whenever they were out hunting. No matter who she was with, her eyes always sought her sister, just to guarantee she was safe. Thankfully, she couldn't even sense any Grim in their surroundings, and either Fox, Velvet, or Blake would alert them if any did enter. They look like they're having fun, Coco said as Blake bumped the Reaper with her shoulder, causing a loud laugh to emanate through the trees. Think they forgot this is supposed to be a mission? Weiss is with them, so I doubt it, Yang replied with a chuckle. Looks like Weiss is having fun too though, Velvet said, pointing with her free hand to the heiress, who did indeed to be chuckling at something Ruby had said. For all Yang's jabs at the girl being a little too tense, even she had to admit that Weiss always seemed noticeably lighter around Ruby. So long as they keep their eyes keen, Coco said. Even though she was wearing sunglasses, Yang knew her girlfriend's eyes were constantly scanning the area. How we looking, Fox? All good at the minute, but something fast keeps dipping in and out of my coverage, the boy answered telepathically. You think it's following us? Velvet replied. Maybe. This forest is usually busier though. All right. Keep us updated. As Coco let herself relax a little, Yang looked ahead again and saw Ruby walking backwards while giving a thumbs up in her direction to show Fox had talked to them as well. Giving her sister a smile back before the girl turned back around to talk to Weiss, Yang reached out and took Velvet's hand. It was always a little more comforting having that little bit of pressure in hers. So what made you decide to come along with us anyway? The fauness asked as Coco moved away a little to check the denser trees. It's just a standard patrol. A little more experience couldn't hurt, She shrugged and smiled at her girlfriend, who gave her a small frown.
What? Experience is one thing, but you've been picking a lot of fights lately. It's just training. It's a lot of training.
Velvet countered her quickly.
Fox, Neon and Ivory, Weiss, Pyrrha, Cyan and Terra. All in the last 2 weeks. I know.
Rubbing her thumb across the back of Velvet's hand, Yang gave her girlfriend an understanding smile.
I promise I'm not overworking myself. I'm just trying to push myself is all. Because of the Hulk? Pretty much.
Yang let out a sigh. It was hard to deny that the Hulk had shaken her a little, even if she was trying her best to not let on. Even when the beast had been severely injured, she'd been practically ineffective in most of her attacks, and what little she had done had been quickly turned on her.
It made me realize that just punching away at something isn't always enough. The Hulk just tossed me aside when I used my semblance at full power, like I was nothing. What use am I in a fight if the opponent is too strong for me? So you've been choosing fast opponents because they're forcing me to use more than just my strength.
Yang confirmed what she knew her girlfriend was about to say.
They're forcing me to be faster and more tactical. It's taking a little bit to get used to is all.
Well, Velvet cuddled up to her side, her other arm wrapping around her forearm as she looked up with a wide smile.
You'll get it. You're a lot more tactical than you think already. Just don't wear yourself out, okay?
Yeah, said Coco, who punched her in the arm as she emerged from behind the trees. Yang was sure it wasn't a coincidence that she'd chosen that moment to come back out.
That's our job.
She winked.
I think I'm gonna vomit. Your fault for eavesdropping, Fox.
A loud forced its way out of Yang's throat, and she could feel Velvet inside her too. It wasn't too unusual for Coco to make such a remark, but Yang loved it. Though she was capable of him, Yang knew that the brunette struggled a little with the more sensitive aspects of the relationship and tended to be a little more upfront with her affection. It didn't bother her, especially since Velvet more than made up for the more sensitive parts, and she actually liked the thrill that Coco's sheer lack of shame brought to the relationship.
So how are things looking over there?
Yang asked curiously.
Quiet, except for their laughter.
Coco replied and nodded towards Ruby, Blake and Yang.
Laughter's good. Doesn't bring grim.
Yang reasoned, ulling a shrug from the girl who glanced over her shoulder.
Besides, I like hearing it. It's good to hear her laugh like that. Ruby or Blake?
Velvet asked.
Or Wise? All of them, though Ruby's is definitely the best. I think you may be a little biased there. More than a little, Bonbon. Shush.
Yang laughed and nudged Coco, who gave her a wide grin in response.
I just like seeing Ruby look like that, you know?
She motioned out to her sister, who looked to be giggling happily about the fact that Blake had an arm draped around her shoulder. It was hard not to notice that Ruby was leaning in close, and that her hand was in the back pocket of Blake's shorts, though from how little reaction was coming from the younger girl, Yang also guessed Ruby also hadn't realized she'd done it.
They definitely seem to be getting closer.
Coco hummed, obviously having noticed the hand placement too.
Yup. Even sleeping in the same bed now, if this morning is anything to go by. Though they could have just fallen asleep while reading. Blake isn't you though, Yang. Oh ha.
Yang smiled at the fondness and placed a swift kiss on her cheek.
So you're still okay with them? Yup.
Yang replied to Coco's question easily.
I think they're good for each other. Blake is definitely letting her walls down slowly, and she seems to make Ruby consider things a little differently. She still told Cobalt off for throwing Carden out a window though. He'll get a lot more than that if he dares touch Velvet again. Yeah, well, that's just her. Likes to defend people no matter what. She did tell him he shouldn't be bullying people when he got back though.
It was true. It hadn't taken long for Carden to climb back through the window, and Ruby had still been telling Cobalt he shouldn't have damaged school property. The scumbag had even stood next to her with a smug smile on his face, only to find Ruby immediately rounding on him and saying that it was his fault for being an asshole, though Ruby's words were a lot nicer. Yang had definitely noticed the smile that it had brought her partner's face while her girlfriend was telling the boy off. She knew it meant a lot to Blake that Ruby was willing to stand up to such a blatant discrimination, even if she did also try to argue that Carden didn't deserve to be thrown out of the window. But that was Ruby, and everyone knew that. If there was a way it could be talked out with words instead of fought with fists, she would argue for that option.
Her naivety could get her hurt in the field, you know? Like it did with the Helk. Coco. It's fine, Velvet.
Yang sighed. Coco's bluntness was something Yang was used to.
She isn't wrong, but I like to think Rubes is just hopeful. She thinks she can save everyone, and that if you just give them a chance, then they will do the right things. I want her to keep that outlook on life. It's not bad to have hope, but that isn't always the case.
Coco's voice remained firm.
As much as I despise the little bastard, Carden might have some redeeming qualities to him since he is taking his training to be a huntsman seriously, but the people we'll be employed to capture once we graduate are not Carden.
The brunette stopped and Yang turned to look at the girl.
You should make sure she's ready to understand that.
Yang stared into her girlfriend's eyes, which was easier since the shades had been removed. She knew the girl was right, and that Ruby would eventually have to accept that some people just couldn't be saved, but she really wanted to hold off on that for as long as she could. But then again, she couldn't have her sister fighting an opponent who was aiming to kill while she was only trying to knock him out. It was already enough of an issue in sparring where she was notably weaker against the other students despite being top 10 on pure combat skill.
I know.
Yang breathed eventually when Velvet's hand closed on hers.
I'm not going to be around to protect her forever, after all. I don't want to get rid of that part of her completely, though. You don't have to.
Velvet smiled up at her.
And I think we all know that Ruby will always give people the chance to do the right thing first.
Coco nodded.
Just make sure she understands when she has to accept they won't. I will.
Yang groaned, wondering exactly how she could even go about that.
She
looked ahead to see Ruby was laughing again, the smile on her face infectious enough to bring one to her own.
Not yet. Take your time,
Coco said, her voice losing the hardness to it as she put her glasses back on.
It's your sis. Incoming.
All three of them turned at Fox's warning, but before Yang could even extend her gauntlets, something black and sharp slammed into her chest and sent her stumbling backwards. Thankfully, activating aura was an instinct at that point, so despite the pain, she remained unharmed as she tumbled backward into a handspring. As she landed in a crouch, she looked up at what had hit her to see a large, cat-like grim baring its teeth at her, its pitch black fur gleaming in the sunlight. Along its spine protruded a row of white spikes that ran down its tail, and a scar ran across its snout. Despite being only half her size while on all fours, Yang knew wisps were exceptionally fast, enough to give Ruby a run for her money, but also knew they definitely should not have been in the Emerald Forest. Normally they roamed around the mountains near southern Sanis. As she watched it though, two more of the creatures crept up to the larger one's side, clearly younger due to their smaller spikes and unscarred faces, and let out a deep growl. Ahead of her, she could see that Velvet and Coco were already fighting their own Grim, and from the sound behind her, the others were too. Knowing she likely wouldn't get any help, she extended her gauntlets and prepared to fight. However, the second she did, the Grim leapt into action, the first charging at her, while the others darted to her sides. They were so fast that they practically turned into wisps of black smoke as they ran. I guess that's where they got the name, Yang thought to herself as the scarred Grim jumped into the air and began to spin, becoming a vicious whir of blades. Dodging it with a simple sidestep, she slammed her fist into what she could only guess was its side, only for a pair of teeth to catch her fist instead. The creature landed from its spin on all fours and tugged at her hand, trying its best to pull her off balance, and as strong as she was, Yang knew the Grim was stronger and that it would eventually succeed, so unloaded a shell into its face. It flinched away as the dust burned its skin, but the second it let go, another landed on her back and tried to bite into her shoulder. As she tried to pry its jaws away, the third slammed into her legs from behind and sent her to her knees. Sensing her vulnerability, they all leapt on her. "Think, Yang," she said to herself, feeling the claws and teeth try their best to break her aura as the sound of gnashing jaws filled her ears. Thankfully, her aura was tough and would only grow stronger. It was then that the plan hit her, and all she had to do was wait a little longer. She needed to be more than just strong. She needed to be smart. So, enduring the pain, she waited for the right moment. It didn't take long though, and as one of the wisps landed in front of her, she activated her semblance and reared her arm back, slamming it into the packed ground that made the path. It ruptured beneath her, her strength cracking the earth and the discharge of a shell causing the rocks to fly into the air. The displacement was enough for the beast to attempt to jump back, and then was exactly what she wanted. Striking out with one hand, she uppercut a wisp that was trying to claw at her right side, sending it into the air as well, and launched herself off the ground into a forward roll while the other still clung to her back. Being airborne, the older Grimm that had avoided her earlier attack had no way to dodge as she came crashing down upon him, the spines of both Grimm digging into each other. Holding her hands out in front of her, she let off another shot, forcing her backwards so that the wisps impaled each other with enough force to turn both of them to actual smoke. When she landed on her back, she rolled to the side just in time to avoid a spiked tail that dug into the mud where her head had just been. "Gotcha!" She grinned and reached out to grab the appendage. With a firm grasp of it, she twisted herself up to her feet and swung it around, smashing the beast's head against a tree and hearing an audible snap. Before it could turn to smoke though, she reared her arm back and flung it at another pack that were approaching Ruby, Weiss, and Blake, the spines on its back turning 3 more of them to smoke before it itself crumbled to nothing. 5 minutes later, when all the Grimm were dead, she leaned back against a tree and let out a deep breath. Closing her eyes, she focused her aura to remove the pain they'd left behind. It only took a second, but when it was gone, she let out a small breath of relief. "Fucking tigers," she sighed as the group gathered. "I think they were pumas actually," Weiss said. "Cousins of Atlas Sabers." "Grimm have cousins?" Ruby asked. "Well, variants is a more accurate term, but that's all second-year stuff." Whatever they are, I hate them." Yang groaned and looked down at her dirty shorts. "I look like I have SH. Please show some class, Yang." "She's all class." Coco grinned and pulled her into a quick kiss. "You do look like you've shit yourself though." "Ugh. We can head back now anyway." Velvet chuckled at Weiss' disgust. "We need to report this to Headmaster Ojben." "Report what?" asked Yatsu. "These Grimm shouldn't have been so far north," Blake answered. "It's something he would want to know about." "At least I can change when we get back." Yang grunted as Velvet tried to wipe some mud off of her. With everyone seemingly in agreement, the group began to make their way back towards the school. Thankfully it wasn't too far, but as Ruby and Weiss moved ahead to talk with Fox and Yatsu, Yang found herself walking beside Blake, who gave her a small look. There was something knowing in her eyes, but that could be anything with the faunus. "What?" she asked, continuing Velvet's earlier effort to remove as much mud as she could. "I heard your conversation with Coco and Velvet," Blake said plainly, her voice a little lower than usual. "About Ruby." "Oh." She stopped trying to get the mud out of her hair and turned to face her partner. She was very aware that one of the things Blake liked about Ruby was just how good she was, so wasn't surprised that the girl seemed to be about to raise an issue with what was said. "They're right." That made her do a double take. "Ruby needs to understand that some people can't be helped." "I thought you would be more opposed." "I don't want her dying because she tries to give the wrong person a chance." Blake sighed. "But you're also right. I don't want that part gone." "Same. Maybe we just stick to making sure she doesn't hold back during sparring anymore." "Sounds good to me." Blake's eyes moved back to their other 2 teammates, who were walking happily ahead of them. Yang knew it was going to be tough to convince Ruby that it was a good thing not to hold back, but if everything turned out as she was hoping, then she would be leaving in a few years to be with Coco and Velvet. Before she left though, she was definitely going to give Ruby the lessons she knew the girl needed if she was going to be the world's best huntress that she wanted to be. That Yang knew she would be. "Why hasn't she collapsed her scythe?" Yang asked curiously, since the weapon was at her side instead of on her back like usual. "She put a gear in wrong apparently while working on it earlier." Blake chuckled. "It won't go back." One day she'll be the best, Yang thought to herself as she laughed and threw an arm around her friend's shoulder. But not today, I guess.
And that's all for today. Thanks for coming by and hanging out. I hope to see you next time.